As we have seen, measurement and metrology is key to modern science. How does this work in intelligence? How do we measure intelligence? Galton invented his own standard of metrology, and he reported it in 1889 to the Royal British Academy. His technique involved a device of a half-second pendulum with a hanging string that was designed to capture reaction time. So on this account, reaction time was the same as intelligence. It was reliable in the sense that people who had short reaction times or had fast reaction times were consistently fast, and people who were slow were consistently slow. But this technique had a problem of external validity. That is, the wrong people ended up being measured as intelligent. It turned out that the people that Galton thought were intelligent were not always fast, and the people who Galton thought were certainly not intelligent, the Irish, the lower class, often had fast reaction times. So this then seemed to not be a very good tool for measuring intelligence. In the United States, in 1889, James McKean Cattell offered a new technique. Cattell was appointed to the University of Pennsylvania, where he opened one of the first psychological laboratories in the country. He decided to make mental measurements on his students, instead of using purely physical measurements of the type that Galton had pioneered. Cattell focused on several things as possibilities. He focused on the strength of somebody's squeeze, the rate that they could move their hands. He focused on the minimum distance between 2 points at which the skin senses them as 2 points rather than 1. He focused on the minimum pressure for causing pain. He focused on the least notable difference in weight. That is, if you're given 1 pound or 1 pound 1 ounce, can you notice a difference between these two weights? He focused on reaction times for sound. He focused on the time it takes to name different colors. He focused on the ability of people to carefully bisect a line of 50 centimeters long. He focused on the ability of people to accurately judge a 10-second period of time. And he focused on the number of letters that an individual could repeat on one hearing. All of these measures for Cattell seem to have little external validity, in the sense that the people who Cattell knew to be intelligent were not necessarily scored as being better or more sensitive or more accurate in performing these tests. The breakthrough was offered ultimately by Alfred Binet. Binet worked in France, and he began with physical tests, actually cranial tests. Here, though, he noticed that differences between the intelligent and the less intelligent were sometimes very small. Looking at students, he noticed that sometimes poor students had better measurements of their skull, and smart students had smaller skulls. What does this imply? Does this mean that the poor students with big skulls were actually more intelligent than the smart students with little skulls? Binet said no. So in 1904, he switched away from the physiological and medical methods for measuring intelligence. Instead, he focused on general tasks. He looked to measure general potential. What he did was design questions and design tests that were based on the questions that could distinguish the good from the bad students. What this meant was that he chose only questions on which the good students were able to do well and the bad students did badly. So this was the Binet test. This was the test that Lewis Terman in the United States standardized. Terman worked at Stanford, and so we have the first so-called standardized IQ test, which is known as the Stanford Binet test. So how do you standardize? Well, one way of answering this is to look at the question that was asked by Helen Thompson Woolley, who asked, how do males and females differ in intelligence? Here she tested for sex differences in motor skills and affective qualities and sensory abilities and intellectual abilities as well. She asked this question by looking over 3 decades at different studies that assessed a range of different qualities. And all of these tests displayed no differences or minor differences in sex. And in some cases, she found that these tests indicated female superiority. Thomson-Woolley found in 1914 in her general review that girls had better scores of intelligence than boys did. So, on standardization, Lewis Terman, in revising the Binet test, also found a slight superiority of girls. His answer was to remove those specific items on which girls did better. on the argument that there's no reason for thinking that girls are more intelligent than boys. So his standardization involved removing the gender differences from the test and resulting in a test in which boys and girls did equally well. How did psychometrics get popularized? One answer is through schooling, and the second answer is through Army. Let's look at schools first. Here, the mark of modern society is the ability to provide universal schooling to all citizens. For this to happen, an engineering approach needed to be brought to schooling. In the United States, this was done through a series of what was known as school surveys. This was an instance of scientific management. Hundreds of school surveys were conducted between 1909 and 1944, and these were commissioned by the city and state governments with the aim of justifying tax expenditures. In this period, we see the beginning of universal public schooling. In 1898, the typical American received only 5 years of schooling, and this itself was an enormous increase. Between 1870 and 1898, the number of pupils in school went from 7 million to 15 million people. By 1900, 31 states had passed compulsory education acts. But in 1886, if all children in Chicago were required to go to school, then only 1/3 of them would have been able to find seats. From 1890 to 1918, one high school was built every day. And during this period, attendance went from 200,000 to 1.65 million people, or a 700% increase in the same time frame. So we see a massive expansion, not only in the number of schools, but the number of people going to schools. And so there was a need for scientific management of the students and of the people working there. The solution was the creation of a finely divided system for dealing with students, or what we now know as grades: first grade, second grade, third grade. No longer would schools rely on the one-room schoolhouse. The other technique was to subdivide grades within them. So that is the slow, the standard, and the advanced sections. And the technique for that would be IQ tests. The second method for popularizing psychometrics or IQ testing was through the Army. The Army faced a similar kind of problem at the dawn of World War I. The problem was that the Army needed to bring in a massive number of new recruits, both at the enlisted level and also for officers. Before World War I, the emphasis in the Army for officers focused on character. The Army asked only that recruits be between 18 and 35, that recruits be a citizen, or that recruits intended to be one. Also demanded that recruits, that is, Army officers, be able to read and write English, and that they not be felons, deserters, insane, or intoxicated. The Army asked that officers be a certain kind of person. They needed to be people who had good character, who had the ability to lead and to discipline men. Officers should have skill and energy in fulfilling their duty. They should have judgment, good appearance, and not have problem with money or drink. So this is the old system. However, under the new system, which focused on intelligence and which used the Army Alpha test, by the end of World War I, 1.75 million tests of intelligence were given. It became a measure not only for enlistment, but also for reporting on Army officers. Army Alpha, then, was used not only for recruitment, but also for sorting. There was a significant set of results that came from all of these Army Alpha tests. It turned out that the average white man tested by Army Alpha came out to have a mental age scored as 13. And if everybody from mental ages between 8 and 12 is considered a moron, then about half of the nation were considered to be morons. In addition, these results varied by the nation of origin of the test takers. People of Russian descent averaged mental age of 11.4. Those of Italian descent averaged 11.1. Those of Polish descent averaged 10.74, and those of so-called Negro descent averaged 10.41. And for the test givers and test takers, all of these characteristics were seen as being racial types. So Russians, Italians, and Poles were considered to be different races. 44% of white and 68% of blacks were considered to be of mental age 10 or below. In addition, there was a high correlation between years of schooling and scores on this test. And African Americans from northern states did better than those from southern states, Indeed, African Americans from northern states did better than whites from those states as well. For immigrants, there was a high correlation between the number of years of test takers, there was a high correlation between the number of years in this country and the score they received on the Army Alpha test. So what did the test makers make of this result? Were the scores of recent immigrants a social product? In fact, no. The test makers argued that recent immigrants, those that had only been in the country for a short period of time, had bad scores because they came from bad stock. As a result, test makers argued for immigration restriction. The psychologist Carl Brigham argued as follows: the hypothesis of growth of intelligence with increasing length of residence may be identified with the hypothesis of an error in the method of measuring intelligence, for we must assume that we are measuring the native or inborn intelligence. So on the one hand, you could see these results as indicating social background or something else. Or on the other hand, you could, as many people did, see the test as valid and as measures of pure intelligence and not cultural background. Indeed, social psychologists like Lewis Terman could argue that the test was valid because it agreed with the things that people already knew and had face validity. People already knew that college professors are smarter than janitors and that railroad executives are smarter than switch tenders, he said. Even more, he said, quote, the offspring of the socially, economically, and professionally successful parents have better mental endowment on the average than the offspring of said janitors and switch tenders. Thus, the intelligence tests were valid, but they also had the virtue of providing a precise measure. The psychologist Edwin Boring offered another sort of argument in favor of the intelligence tests. His argument was that intelligence tests were valid by definition. That is, your intelligence is precisely what your score is on the test. It is just like distance or height. Your height is what a ruler says it is. You don't go around saying that there is some mysterious component of height that can't be measured by the ruler, and you don't, by the same reasoning, go around saying that intelligence tests fail to measure some component of intelligence. Your height is not a social product, nor is your intelligence, Boring argues.